On a wall most visitors never see, behind stone that was carved before the first pharaoh was ever laid in the ground, the ancient Egyptians left an answer to the question we are still asking today. Not a myth, not a vague symbol open to interpretation. A statement, written in their own hand, about who their gods actually were, and where those gods came down from. And the answer they gave was not heaven in some soft, poetic sense. It was a specific point in the sky, a single star. They named it, they tracked it for thousands of years, they built their entire calendar around the night it returned. And they aligned temples and tombs so that this one star would shine straight into the dark at the exact moment it mattered. That is the part the textbooks skip. We are told the Egyptians worshipped gods. We are not told that they wrote down where those gods came from, pointed at the same place in the sky for 3,000 years, and never once changed their story. For decades, the official line has been simple. The gods of Egypt were metaphors, personifications of the sun, the river, the harvest, ways for a primitive people to make sense of nature. The hawk-headed one was the sky. The jackal-headed one was death. The woman with the star on her crown was just the flooding of the Nile, dressed up in mythology. Clean, tidy, and it falls apart the moment you actually read what the Egyptians wrote about these beings themselves. Because they did not describe them as ideas. They described them as rulers. They gave them names, reigns, and lengths of rule measured in thousands of years. They said these beings lived here on the ground among people before there were any human kings at all. And in their own records, which still survive, they listed those god kings by name, in order, the same way they would later list ordinary pharaohs. Today, we are going to go through exactly what those sealed inscriptions say, who these beings were according to the people who actually worshiped them, and where the Egyptians insisted they came from. Because the explanation, handed to the public, leaves the strangest evidence completely unaddressed. Most people who think about Egyptian gods picture cartoon figures on a tomb wall, animal heads on human bodies, decoration. And they assume the meaning is obvious, that ancient people simply imagined their gods looking like the animals around them. But stop and ask the question almost no one asks. Why animals at all? Why would a civilization this precise, this obsessed with order, this capable of building monuments we still cannot fully replicate, choose to depict its most sacred beings as half human, half creature? The standard answer is that each animal represented a trait. The jackal lurked near graves, so the god of the dead got a jackal's head. The lioness was fierce, so the war goddess got a lion's face. Convenient. But the Egyptians had a word for these beings, and it does not mean animal spirit. It does not even cleanly mean God, the way we use the word. The word was neter, plural neteru, and it pointed at something closer to a force, a power, a conscious principle that moved through the world. The animal forms were not the beings. They were masks, a way of showing to a population that could not read which power you were looking at. And the texts are explicit that these beings could take any form they wanted, man, woman, bird, serpent, tree, and change between them at will. That is not how you describe a metaphor for the harvest. That is how you describe something the writer believed was real, present, and not quite human. And look at what these beings were said to have brought. Thoth, the one with the head of an ibis, was credited not with merely representing wisdom, but with literally giving humanity writing, mathematics, medicine, and the measurement of time handed down, fully formed, to a people who supposedly had none of it. Osiris taught agriculture and law, and then was killed and resurrected. Isis, his wife, held the secret knowledge of magic and healing. Ptah was the craftsman who spoke the world into being. Each neter governed a domain, and in the texts, the domains are not poetic abstractions. They are the actual technologies of civilization, the things that separate a settled, literate, organized people from a scattered one. The Egyptians did not claim they invented these things. They claimed they were taught them by beings who arrived already knowing. Strip the religious language away, and you are left with a founding story that sounds less like the slow climb of a people teaching themselves and more like a transfer of knowledge from somewhere or someone that already had it. Here is the first thing that should unsettle you. The Egyptians did not think their gods had always been distant. They believed there was a specific era, a first age, when these beings physically ruled Egypt. They had a name for it. They called it Zeptepi, the first time. And in their telling, it was a golden age. The waters of a primordial chaos pulled back, darkness was pushed away, and the first land rose. And onto that land came the Neteru, who lived among people and governed directly. They gave humanity what the texts describe as the gifts of civilization: law, writing, agriculture, the knowledge of the stars, not slowly, over generations of trial and error. Given, handed down by beings who already had it. And between these gods and ordinary men, the records describe an in-between class of figures, lesser divine beings whose title translates almost too neatly as the Watchers. Beings who observed, who recorded, who kept the memory of the first time alive after the gods themselves had withdrawn. You do not have to believe a word of it to feel how strange it is that the most organized civilization of the ancient world built its entire identity around the claim that it was founded, in person, by beings from the sky. And this is where it stops being mythology and starts being a problem, because the Egyptians wrote it down as history, not in a storybook, in their official record of kings. There is a document, the Turin King List, written on papyrus during the reign of Ramesses II, that catalogs the rulers of Egypt going back in time. Pharaoh after pharaoh, dynasty after dynasty, with the years of each reign noted beside the name, exactly as a careful scribe should. And then you reach the top of the list, the oldest part. And the entries do not stop at the first human king. They keep going. Above the human pharaohs, the same document lists the gods themselves as rulers of Egypt, and it assigns them reigns, long ones. Some of these god kings are recorded as having ruled for hundreds or thousands of years each, with the followers of Horus reigning before the first mortal sat on the throne. This is not a myth scrawled on a temple wall by a priest. It is a bureaucratic record, the ancient equivalent of a government archive. And the people keeping it saw no contradiction in writing the names of gods at the head of a list of real kings. To them, the first time was not legend. It was simply the earliest chapter of their own history, and the gods were the first entry in the ledger. And the Turin Papyrus is not alone. There is an even older artifact, the Palermo Stone, a slab of black rock carved during the Old Kingdom that records the earliest rulers of Egypt. And it, too, reaches back past the human kings into a line of pre-dynastic rulers and divine beings. When an Egyptian priest named Manetho later compiled the full history of his country for the Greeks, he opened it the same way, not with a man, but with dynasties of gods who ruled Egypt directly, followed by the demigods and the followers of Horus, and only then the first human pharaoh. 3 separate sources, written centuries apart, and they all tell the same sequence. Gods first, then a transitional race of half-divine kings, then us. The reign lengths attached to these god kings are staggering. Figures that, taken at face value, stretch the rule of the gods over Egypt across tens of thousands of years before the pyramids. Historians read those numbers as exaggeration, as the inflation of myth. Maybe, but the structure underneath the numbers never wavers, and it is the structure that matters. Every Egyptian record of its own origins begins in the same place, with beings who came from the sky and ruled the land in person. If you find buried history this unsettling, hold that feeling, because the next part is where the question in the title finally has an answer the Egyptians gave themselves. And there is a place where they spelled it out at length, on walls that were sealed away from the public eye. Deep inside the Temple of Horus at Edfu, carved into the inner enclosure where only priests were permitted, there is a body of inscriptions modern scholars call the building texts. They are not the usual praise of a pharaoh. They describe the origin of the world, a primeval island that rose from the waters at the dawn of everything, and the divine beings who came to that island to establish the first sacred ground. The texts speak of a company of these beings, founders, who arrived after a great destruction, who surveyed the land and raised the first structures and set down the pattern that every temple after them would copy. They are described as the ones who existed before, the builders of the original world, and the followers of Horus are named among those who carried that work forward. This is not loose mythology scrawled for tourists. It is a detailed, internal, sealed account of where the gods came from and what they did when they arrived, written by the priesthood, for the priesthood, in the holiest part of the temple, where they had no reason to perform for anyone. And what it preserves is a memory of beings who came from elsewhere, founded civilization on a single rising piece of land, and then handed it down. So where did these beings come from? The Egyptians answer the question, and they answer it consistently, and they answer it by pointing at the sky. Specifically, they point at one star above all others. We call it Sirius. They called it Sopdet. The Greeks later called it Sothis. And to the Egyptians, it was not just another light in the dark. It was the most important star in their entire religious system. And they tied it directly to their gods. Sopdet was a goddess in her own right, depicted as a woman crowned with a five-pointed star. And the texts pair her with Sa, the divine figure they identified with the constellation we call Orion. And here is the connection that should make the hair on your arms stand up. Orion was Osiris, the most important god in the Egyptian afterlife, the Lord of Resurrection, the king who died and rose again, was identified with that specific constellation. And the bright star beside it, Sirius, was tied to Isis, his wife. The two most central deities in Egyptian religion were not floating in some abstract heaven. They were pinned to two specific objects in the night sky, in the same patch of sky, and the Egyptians watched them obsessively. When they imagined the journey of the soul after death, they described it as a voyage toward that region of stars. The destination of the dead, the home of the gods, and the origin point of the beings they worshipped all converged on the same coordinates above the southern horizon. Now understand how deep this went, because it was not a passing belief. It was the backbone of their civilization. Every year, after months of being invisible, Sirius would rise again just before dawn, low on the eastern horizon, what astronomers call the heliacal rising. And in Egypt, that single event triggered everything. It happened right before the Nile began to flood. And the flood was life itself, the difference between famine and survival. The moment the river deposited the black silt that made the desert bloom. The Egyptians noticed that the return of this one star and the return of the life-giving waters arrived together year after year, like clockwork. So they built their calendar on it. Their entire year, all 365 days, was anchored to the morning Sirius reappeared. They called its return a festival, the coming of Sopdet, and they treated it as the renewal of the world. Think about what that means. The most advanced civilization of the ancient world set its clock not by the sun alone, but by the rising of the star they associated with the goddess Isis and the home of their gods. They were, in the most literal sense, a society that lived its entire life by the movements of a single star they believed their gods came from. And they did not stop at watching it. They built for it. The great temple complex of Isis at Philae was oriented so that the goddess most closely tied to Sirius was honored in line with the star's domain in the sky. At Dendera, the Temple of Hathor preserves a famous ceiling, the Dendera Zodiac, a detailed star map carved in stone, proof that these priests were not casually glancing upward, but recording the heavens with the care of astronomers. Temple after temple along the Nile was laid out, so that a specific star or sunrise would penetrate the building's axis on a specific sacred day, sending light down a corridor of stone into a sanctuary that stayed dark the rest of the year. This is architecture used as an instrument, a way of catching a single moment of the sky and freezing it into the design of a building. You do not go to that much trouble for a decoration. You do it because the alignment is the point, because the return of that light is the return of something you are waiting for. And then there is the oldest puzzle on the plateau, the Great Sphinx, which the Egyptians associated with the horizon and the first light of creation, shows patterns of erosion on its enclosure walls that some geologists argue were caused by prolonged rainfall. Heavy, sustained water, the kind that has not fallen on that part of Egypt since long before the accepted date of the monument's carving. If that reading is correct, and it is fiercely debated, then the Sphinx would be far older than the textbooks allow, old enough to brush up against the era the Egyptians themselves called the First Time. The mainstream rejects the early date, but the argument exists because the stone itself raises a question the standard timeline struggles to answer. And the Egyptians had already told us, in their own records, that something stood here in an age before their kings. And it gets stranger, because their fascination with this star carried a piece of knowledge that by every rule of history, they should not have had. Sirius is not one star, it is two. There is the brilliant blue-white star we see, Sirius A, and orbiting it there is a second invisible companion, Sirius B, a white dwarf so dense that a teaspoon of its material would weigh tons, and so faint that the human eye cannot see it at all. Western science did not even suspect its existence until the 1840s and did not actually observe it until 1862 with a powerful telescope. It is, for all practical purposes, an invisible star. And yet, in West Africa, the Dogon people, whose traditions connect back through the deep cultural memory of this region, preserved a tradition describing Sirius as a system of more than one star, including a small, incredibly heavy, invisible companion that circled the bright one over a period of about 50 years. The orbital period is right, the density is right, the invisibility is right. This is knowledge about a star you cannot see without modern instruments, held by a people who had no telescopes. Now, skeptics have a real argument here. They point out that the anthropologists who recorded this may have accidentally fed modern astronomy back to the Dogon during their interviews, contaminating the record. That is a fair criticism, and it has to be on the table. But it does not erase the deeper pattern. Across this whole region of the ancient world, one star, and specifically the idea that it was more than it appeared, sat at the center of the sacred. The obsession is real, even if the cleanest version of the mystery has cracks in it. So that is the answer the Egyptians themselves gave, etched into their walls and woven into their calendar. The beings they worshipped were not local nature spirits. They were rulers from a first age, associated again and again with one region of the sky, one constellation, and one star they tracked for the entire length of their civilization. That is what the inscriptions say. The question is what to make of it. And this is where the story splits into two roads, and you have to decide which one the evidence actually supports. The mainstream road says this is all symbolism, and it makes a serious case. Of course, an agricultural society would deify the star that predicted its harvest. Of course, they would map their most important gods onto the brightest, most reliable objects in the sky. That is what humans everywhere have done, from the Greeks to the Maya. The animal-headed gods were teaching tools. The god kings at the top of the Turin list were a way of giving the institution of kingship a divine origin, a founding myth, the same way later empires claimed descent from gods to justify their rule. There is nothing here, the mainstream says, that requires anything more than a sophisticated, sky-watching people projecting their hopes onto the heavens. And that explanation deserves respect, because a great deal of it is almost certainly true. The Egyptians were astronomers of the first rank. They did not need visitors from a star to look up and be moved by the brightest one. But here is what that explanation, on its own, leaves sitting in the corner of the room. It does not fully account for the precision. The Egyptians did not just admire Sirius. They engineered around it. Certain temples were aligned so that the light of the heliacal rising would travel down a corridor and strike a sanctuary at the exact moment of the star's return. The southern shafts of the Great Pyramid's chambers point, by careful measurement, toward the belt of Orion and the region of Sirius as they appeared in the sky thousands of years ago. The three Great Pyramids of Giza sit in a pattern that mirrors, with uncanny closeness, the three stars of Orion's belt, the constellation they identified with Osiris, the Lord of Resurrection. The very god they believed founded their world. The mainstream calls this the natural result of star worship. But notice what it would take to lay out monuments of that scale to match a constellation. A survey of the heavens precise enough to transfer the geometry of the sky onto the ground across acres of desert, with stones weighing tons, 4,500 years ago. The belief might be symbolic. The engineering is not. The engineering is real, measurable, and still not fully explained. And this is the point where a name enters the story that you would not expect. Nikola Tesla. Because Tesla, near the height of his work on wireless power, became fascinated with the pyramids of Egypt. He did not see them as tombs. He saw them as machines. Tesla's life's obsession was the idea that the Earth itself is electrically alive, that the planet carries a natural charge, that energy could be drawn from it and transmitted through it and through the atmosphere, without a single wire. He built a tower at Wardenclyffe to prove it, designed to use the Earth and the sky as one enormous electrical circuit. And when he looked at the Great Pyramid, he believed he was looking at the same idea, built in stone, thousands of years before him. He argued that the pyramid's geometry, its precise alignment, and its sheer mass were not chosen for a burial. They were chosen to resonate, to tune the structure to the natural frequencies of the Earth, and act as a resonant cavity, a receiver and amplifier of energy that was already there in the ground and the air. And the strange thing is that Tesla's instinct lines up with something physics later confirmed. The Earth genuinely does have a natural electromagnetic heartbeat. It is called the Schumann resonance, a standing wave that circles the entire planet, trapped in the gap between the ground and the upper atmosphere, vibrating at a base frequency of roughly 7.8 hertz. Tesla did not have the name for it, but he was chasing exactly this phenomenon, the idea that the whole planet rings like a bell at a frequency you can tune into. And here is a detail that fed his fixation. The Great Pyramid's measurements appear to encode the dimensions of the Earth itself, its height and base relating to the planet's size, in a way that should not happen by accident in a simple tomb. The pyramid theorists take his thread and pull it further. They point out that the Great Pyramid's chambers concentrate radio waves, that its core was built in part from quartz-bearing granite, a stone that generates electrical charge when you put it under pressure, and that the whole structure sits on the planet like an antenna planted on a node of the Earth's energy. In this reading, the monuments tied to the stars were not just symbolic markers of where the gods lived, they were instruments, built by a people who claimed their knowledge came from beings who descended from the sky, designed to resonate with the Earth and aimed at the heavens. Now, does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? That beings literally crossed from a star to found Egypt and left machines behind? No. And I am not going to pretend it does, because the truth here is strange enough without the hype. The skeptics are right that the Dogon evidence is compromised. They are right that a brilliant star predicting the harvest is reason enough to worship it. They are right that Tesla, for all his genius, never published a rigorous proof that the pyramid was a power plant, and that much of what gets attributed to him about Egypt was embroidered by people who came after. The piezoelectric quartz in the granite is real, but a stone that produces a faint charge under pressure is a long way from a working generator. Every one of the most dramatic claims has a deflating, ordinary answer waiting beside it. And intellectual honesty means putting those answers on the table instead of hiding them. But strip all of that away. Take away every alien, every power plant, every wild leap, and look at what is simply, undeniably left. A civilization that wrote, in its own official records, that it was founded and ruled by beings who came before human kings. A people who pinned their two most important gods to a specific constellation and a specific star, and who built that star into the foundation of their calendar, their religion, and their idea of the afterlife. Monuments aligned to the heavens with a precision we struggle to match. A star at the center of it all that turned out, against all odds, to hide an invisible companion the ancients seemed to whisper about. And a structure so geometrically pure that one of the greatest electrical minds in modern history looked at it and saw not a grave, but a machine. You do not need extraterrestrials to be unsettled by that. You just need to read what the Egyptians actually wrote and refuse to look away from it. The mystery does not come from inventing things. It comes from taking the ancient texts seriously and noticing that the people who left them were not confused, primitive, or vague. They were precise, consistent, and absolutely certain about where their gods came from. And that certainty is the part that lingers. We file the Egyptians under a category ancient, superstitious, a people who mistook the natural world for the divine. But this was a culture that calculated the length of the year to within minutes, that tracked the slow drift of the stars across centuries, that built to tolerances modern engineers respect. When a people that careful tell you, in writing, over and over for 3,000 years, that their gods came down from a particular place in the sky, you are left with an uncomfortable choice. Either they were imagining all of it with extraordinary consistency, or they were recording something as best they could in the only language they had. We have spent 2 centuries assuming the first. The inscriptions have been sitting there the whole time saying the second. And the deepest layers of those inscriptions, the sealed ones, the ones behind walls and inside chambers that were closed off before recorded history began, have still not given up everything they hold. Every year, new corridors are found, new texts are scanned, new alignments are measured. The picture is not getting simpler. It is getting stranger. And the question the Egyptians answered so plainly, who were the beings they worshipped and where did they come from, turns out to be a question we are only now equipped to take seriously. Because we finally have the instruments to check whether the sky they pointed at really does hold what they said it held. So they told us. That is the part that should stay with you. The most studied civilization on Earth wrote down the answer to a question we treat as unanswerable, carved it into stone, and waited for someone to believe them. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you up at night, the next investigation on screen reveals a discovery that connects to this one in a way you will not see coming. Subscribe before you go, so the next time the stones give up a secret, you are the first to know.